Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today I'm going to be giving you my 3 big key takeaways from an awesome MixCon masterclass that just went down with 2 dudes who are major forces in the world of film score composing and composing for games and TV shows. Jake Jackson, award-winning film score mixer, and Christian Henson, who's an award-winning film score composer. They've worked on major games, TV shows, movies, things like Star Wars, Loki, Black Mirror, Doctor Who. They've worked with a bunch of artists as well. I believe Jake has worked with the likes of Bon Iver, Nick Cave, Laura Pausini. Christian's worked with artists from bands like Massive Attack and Blur, and the list just goes on and on. But the masterclass they gave us was really about working with sample libraries and working with live recorded instruments and kind of making those 2 things blend together. So for anyone out there who's either working in the scoring world or relies heavily on orchestral sample libraries or just occasionally uses them in their work, I think there's some great insights in this one that we're going to go into in some detail today. Of course, for the long version, we've got an hour-plus MixCon presentation. Definitely want to check that out right here on our YouTube channel. But if you want the quick Cliff Notes version, you're going to get right now in podcast format from me. I was able to kind of go in there and distill quickly down some of, I think, the core takeaways. Big quick shout out and thanks to our sponsors, Spitfireaudio. Both Christian and Jake have made sample libraries for those guys. You got to check out them at spitfireaudio.com, making some of the best libraries out there. Also, a big shout out and thanks to Soundtoys, one of my favorite makers of creative mixing effects. And you'll see Jake Jackson use some of their stuff on the mix, even their crystallizer and some interesting effects that you might not expect to see in an orchestral mix, as well as FabFilter, also sponsoring this month. And FabFilter, again, shows up in Jake Jackson's mixes. It's actually probably the primary EQ I saw him use. And I want to give you some of the insights I got about using EQ in the orchestral and film score context from Jake Jackson and watching the way he works. All right, let's dive right into it. So, big takeaway number 1 that came up more than once is that Jake has worked with bands, mixing for bands, and like conventional pop, rock, idiom, right? And he's also done extensive work in the film score world. And he'd be one of the first to tell you that these are 2 entirely different animals, and the mix approach and mix process is very much different. One of the things that came up is a lot of the kind of mixing tricks that we're aware of and used to and know in the context of working with traditional pop and rock and hip hop and whatever electronic multitracks don't apply to film score mixing and orchestral mixing. A lot of the things you might expect to do to really kind of go in and carve out areas so you can fit all of these puzzle pieces together doesn't, or at least shouldn't, happen in the orchestral scoring and film score world most of the time. And we'll talk about some key exceptions to that. But the EQ that Jake is doing is pretty minimal. The biggest thing is they're selecting the right sounds from the instrument libraries to begin with. And then once they've created a full demo that, honestly, Christian's demo that he created just by himself using nothing but like the Spitfire audio libraries to compose the track, sounded pretty darn good and sounded better than a lot of scores right off the bat. But then they went to famous Air Studios in London and tracked a multi-piece orchestra to go over that demo and basically blended that demo together with the new string sections they captured. And in that context, you're getting great sounds in a great space recorded going in, and you're selecting the right sample sounds for the mood you want to evoke. And you're not necessarily going in and doing the puzzle pieces of EQ to reshape things. You're not going in and doing radical compression. The most common effect that's used there is something like reverb, and we'll talk about Jake's approach to reverb. But for Jake, the mix in this context is a lot more about just balancing things. The mixing part of mixing becomes the most essential and important part. And a lot of what he's dealing with is what should be featured and when, which elements should be brought forward a little closer to the listener and sound a little bit more edgy, which one should be pushed a little further back in the soundscape, how can we get the thing to sound wide without losing focus. So much of what he's doing is with level, balance, pan, and then reverb sends. And there's just a couple of reverbs in here. I mean, there's actually 24 reverbs, but they're the same two or so reverbs again and again. And we'll get into that in a little bit in just a second, some more detail there. But his use of EQ really speaks to this approach where a lot of the time he's going in there and trying to make things just sound a little prettier, a little bit more impressive, a little bit better using EQ. And he'll often do one or two bell cuts or boosts. And you see this happen again and again and again. He grabs his FabFilter Pro Q EQ, and he finds a spot, say in the upper mid-range on strings that might need to be softened. He remarked that in a lot of sample libraries, there's a little bit of extra brightness in strings in the 2 to 3K region that gives them a little bit more edge than you might want if you compare that to real finished film scores that are recorded on a scoring stage. So often go in some of those sounds and dip in that area, say 2 or 3K. And then there might be a corresponding boost down lower in the frequency spectrum. So he might have a little cut between 1 and 3 dB and a little boost down bottom between 1 and 3 dB. And he's looking to enhance the overall sound. And this is very different advice than you'll likely be given from advanced mixers in the pop and rock world and the hip hop world and the EDM world, where it's like, hey, sometimes you need to reshape things dramatically. And don't even listen to these things in solo. And if you do boosts and cuts of 5 and 6 dB, that could be okay. It's not always necessary. Sometimes you don't want to touch anything with EQ, but it could potentially be okay to make the puzzle pieces fit together, to give everything the separation it needs. But here in the orchestral context, the goal is not necessarily separation. The goal, again and again, Christian brings up, is to make all of these players sound like they're in the same room together. That's the aesthetic that Christian, the composer, is going for. And that's the aesthetic that Jake is looking for in the mix. And that's what you hear in a lot of really impressive film scores. How to make these people feel like they're in the same room together, acting almost as a singular instrument with lots of different parts within its personality. So it's a little bit different than the traditional rock and pop context that a lot of new mixers might be used to. So the EQ, often gentle and often two corresponding boosts and cuts. I talked about him often using bells fairly wide, and it could be the opposite of what I just said. So in another particular instrument, he dipped that same 2 to 3K area, but then above it, lifted up the high frequency, kind of reshaping that area. In yet another sound, he found a little bit of a high mid-range boost to bring out, and then did a corresponding little cut in the low end, using the frequency analyzer in the Pro Q exactly the way I'd recommend it, to first, by ear, say, which area do I want to cut? Oh, it's probably somewhere here between 100 and 200, and now I'm just going to double check my frequency analyzer so I can zero in on the exact frequency. Again, doing fairly broad boosts and cuts, bell filter, fairly wide. And you just saw that approach come up again and again. And only on a very, very minor group of things like mandolin here and there, you'd see extreme low frequency roll-offs, but often that kind of thing wasn't happening. Now, another thing that's a little bit different is the use of reverb here. There were something like, close to 100 or so-ish tracks on this session, and there ended up being 24 different reverbs. That sounds like a lot, right? But those 24 reverbs are actually there just so he can more easily make stems in the mix. Because they ultimately want to send stemmed out versions to the final mix for the final film mix, so that in case there's a line of dialogue that's getting lost, they could just pull down the percussion or just pull down the strings or whatever it is, rather than necessarily having to pull up and down all of the music. So they're sending a final mix of stems that has the reverb baked into them. So really, for convenience more than anything, there's 20-something different reverb tracks. But they're really relying on predominantly two reverbs that are stacked together. There is a convolution reverb, in this case it's the altiverb reverb, and there's also an algorithmic reverb. And those two reverbs layered together, both Christian and Jake found that they sound a little bit more natural to them, in the respect that you don't hear the specific character of either one of these reverbs. And basically everything in the entire mix was sent to those two reverbs so that they could feel like they're in the same room together. There was also one third reverb that was crazy long and had about a 10-second tail on it. And that was really used more for special effects and special instances, sparingly here and there. So you had your primary stack of two reverbs that were filling in each other's holes, the convolution reverb and the algorithmic reverb, stacked on top of each other, kind of medium longish. And then a super long effecty reverb that was used for particular specific elements. And that gets me into yet another big idea from this, which is that there are certain elements where all the things I just said go out the window a little bit. So in this particular mix, there was like a prepared piano where I think Christian had molested and destroyed and mutilated some poor old piano that's about to be thrown away with, nails and screws and saw blades and things. And for an instrument like that, they weren't afraid to use things like delays, like the super long reverb, maybe doing a little bit more EQ and a little bit more processing than you'd otherwise see. There was a synth in there where Jake wasn't afraid to go in and add a chorus pedal to it. So there are more synthetic elements, even in this context, where you can take a more synthetic approach. And then there's the more natural sounding elements where they took a very, very natural sounding approach. So I think we've gotten to a bunch of ideas that are ready. That's kind of almost 3. And the last big thing that was an interesting takeaway here is just the way they work as far as client revisions and mixing with or without the client. And both Christian and Jake prefer to mix without the client there in the room. In this case, I'm referring to Christian, the composer, as the client, even though both of them had yet another client, the end director. But, in the Jake-Christian relationship, the composer Christian is kind of the client to Jake, the mixer. And Christian would really prefer to start off in the morning listening to some stuff and going over notes with Jake and then letting Jake do his thing. And then coming back later for the same kind of process rather than being there with him the whole time. And I've got to say, I would generally agree that this is a better approach to having the client in the chair, in the room with you all the time, unless there's someone who's really super interested in mixing themselves. But honestly, sometimes those are the worst people to have in the room with you. And sometimes the biggest benefit that end client or producer or decider is going to offer is the benefit of them coming in with fresh ears, listening to things from a big picture perspective, and talking about the few basic core important things that need to change instead of getting in there and micromanaging. So you can have one person who's kind of zoomed out and one person who's kind of zoomed in. And Jake also talks about how having Christian, the composer, come in on occasion and listen to the stuff with him and just give notes helps him zoom out. And Christian really recommends doing this in this context. I believe he's talking about, maybe once a day, first thing in the morning, to kind of check in on the latest batch of mixes, rather than having Jake go through the entire mix, the entire 2 hours worth of score material, mix all of that, and then give it back to Christian for notes. They took a different approach, which was, let's mix the first handful of cues. I'll just mix them to the best of my ability, me, Jake, the mixer. And now that I'm done with that, Christian, come on in, give me your feedback. Tell me if we're going in the right direction with this. Give me your notes on it. Let's perfect these first few cues. Great. Now I can use that as an overall template and idea for your taste, where we want to go. And now I'll go through the next, half dozen or so cues, and we'll check back on that one. And hopefully as the process goes on, there's fewer and fewer notes. And I found a process like that to work exceptionally well for me these days in mastering, where when I'm mastering a album for a client, sometimes I really love if we have the time to just work on one track together, really get that one shining very well, kind of go back and forth a little bit on it, and let that track then set the template for the rest of the record. And that can be a decent way to work when time allows for it. And in mixing in standard contexts of more popular music, that same kind of approach can work really well. Rather than mixing the entire album and then getting feedback, starting with a track or two, getting the feedback on those, and then using that feedback to fold into the rest of the mix process. Well, I hope those were some decent insights for you. I really implore you, if you have the hour, to check it out, the full-length Mixcon masterclass from these two. It's an absolutely beautiful and a little bit kind of terrifying, suspenseful score from Christian Hansen, and a great mix from Jake Jackson. You'll hear the before and after. And although I'm a big proponent of, it not all being about little choices in mixing, and sometimes you got to look for the big wins and the big changes that are really going to make a difference, man, I've got to say, Jake in this mix does so many little things that really do add up over time to a kind of final layer of polish without any one of those changes he's making really being a big win. This is one of those things where it's that final painstaking sanding of just smoothing out an edge here and enhancing a detail there. And really great to see him work in that style. And it really did turn into a stunning thing. One last thing I'd say is that in this particular cinematic mix, Jake wasn't afraid to lean a little bit hard on the close mics. There were close mics on each one of the live recorded instruments, and he actually leaned a little bit heavier into those to give things a little bit more of an upfront and maybe slightly aggressive feel, I guess you'd say, because of the suspenseful nature of this particular score. And he wasn't afraid to pan pretty wide on those strings either, and it really brings out a lot of beautiful detail into it. I hope you enjoy this one. Definitely check it out in full length over at the SonicScoop YouTube channel. That's sonicscoop.com/YouTube video. Or if you're here on the YouTube channel already, it's probably just going to be up somewhere on the screen. You can click on all that good stuff. Remember to enter for your chance to win thousands of dollars worth of free gear over at the MixCon Mega Giveaway. You can check that out at sonicscoop.com/MixCon giveaway. That's sonicscoop.com/MixCon giveaway, where you can enter for 3 chances to win thousands of dollars worth of free gear. Big shout out and thanks to our sponsors this week. We got Spitfireaudio, makers of some of the best sample libraries, virtual instruments out there for film score composing. And of course, a lot of people use them across genres, but definitely check them out at spitfireaudio.com. Big thanks also to Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free over at soundtoys.com. And big thanks to FabFilter, sponsoring the podcast this month, making really great both creative and utility mixing effects. You see the Pro Q plugin everywhere on Jake Jackson's mix. Check them out over at fabfilter.com. Last but not least, if you want some free stuff, you got it. I've got a workshop for you called the 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer. If you want to tie together the common threads that you're going to find in all of the MixCon presentations from this year and the past 7 years of MixCon, you definitely want to check out that presentation. These are the things that tie the approach and the process of all of the amazing mixers we've studied on this channel together. Get that for free over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits for the 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer. Or if you want a primer on mastering, you can check out my Intro to Mastering workshop at sonicscoop.com/mastering101, sonicscoop.com/mastering101. For those of you ready to go deeper, of course, we got the full-length courses that come with a money-back guarantee. People love them. You got to check out Mixing Breakthroughs now in its 2.0 iteration, and Mastering Demystified, where I tell you everything that I know about mastering to get you started in mastering yourself. All right. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Coletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.